Welcome back to the Deep Dive. And if you're joining us again, you'll know this is just one piece of a bigger picture.
That's right. This is actually part 2 of a 7-part journey we're on.
A really deep dive into Eritrea's history. And it's all based completely on the source material you've given us.
Exactly.
And look, if you just jumped in here and you missed part 1, we really recommend going back.
Yeah, definitely. We laid some important groundwork there.
And today, we're building right on top of that foundation.
We are. Last time we, barely scratched the surface, just the earliest hints of people there.
Right.
So today, using these sources you've provided, we're really moving forward. The mission is to explore Eritrea's ancient history.
Okay.
Trace those big regional powers, how they rose, how they fell. Look at the external influences, too.
Which seems like a recurring theme.
It is. And then get into those really critical early periods, the ones leading up to modern times and that long struggle for self-determination.
So the goal today is navigating all that complexity, using the sources, pulling out the really fascinating bits, the key turning points.
That's the plan.
Okay, let's pick it up then. Back to the incredibly deep past.
Let's do it. The sources, they paint this picture of a land with roots going way, way back, like dawn of humankind back.
Yeah.
They talk about hominoid remains 2 million years old. It positions this area right near the start of things.
2 million years. It's almost impossible to really grasp that time scale.
It is.
And what really jumped out at me from the sources was the mention of those stone tools.
Oh, yes, the Abdir find.
Yeah.
Very significant.
125,000 years ago. And the sources stress this is the earliest, best dated evidence for humans living right on the coast, using marine resources.
Right. It's fascinating. It shows this really deep, ancient connection between people there and the sea, not just the land.
A long time ago.
And it continues. The sources then mention tools in the Barca Valley, 8000 BC, so more settled life. And then rock paintings from 2000 BC. You see this progression. Culture developing over millennia.
And it wasn't just a few spots, was it? The sources mentioned 51 prehistoric sites found so far.
51, yeah. And they expect more, stretching from Karora all the way down to Beilu.
So this wasn't some empty land. It was pretty widely inhabited, even way back then.
Seems that way. The sources also touch on who the earliest people might have been, maybe related to Central African pygmies.
Interesting.
And then later, mixing with other groups coming in, Nilotic peoples, Cushitic, Semitic, arriving from places like the Nubian lowlands.
So a real melting pot even back then, this mixing of cultures, it seems like a constant thread.
It really does shape the region,
And talking about ancient connections, this part in the sources really caught my eye. The land of Punt.
Ah, Punt, the legendary land.
Mentioned by Egyptian pharaohs, the sources say they sent major expeditions there between like 2900 and 2600 BC.
They did. Big ones.
Why? Because the sources say it was loaded with stuff. Gold, frankincense, myrrh, ostrich feathers, ebony, ivory, all the precious things.
Exactly. That idea that this area might be connected to that fabled land sought by ancient Egypt, it's pretty amazing, isn't it?
It really is. That quest for resources, connecting to major powers, it kind of sets the stage, doesn't it?
It leads us right into the next big era the sources cover, ancient empires and city-states. Specifically, the Adulite era.
Right, 9th century BC to the 5th century AD. That's a long time.
Almost 1,400 years. Remarkable stability in a way.
So what was Adulis like? What do the sources say?
They describe Adulis, the city-state, right there on the Red Sea, as this major hub. Commerce, trade. For that whole period, its location was just perfect.
A vital link.
Definitely.
But it wasn't just Adulis on the coast, was it? The sources mention other important centers popping up inland, too.
That's right. Places around where modern Asmara is, Kohaido, Tikanda, Keskisi, Matera, Dera.
And the sources suggest they were connected, linked by trade routes.
Exactly. Connecting the coast deep into the African interior. And archaeology is still uncovering just how significant these places were. They're still digging,
Fascinating. And there were outsiders interested even then. Greeks, Egyptians.
Yep. The sources mention them setting up hunting and trading posts. From the 3rd century BC, on the coast, but also up in the highlands.
And what were they after? What was being traded?
Oh, a whole list. Obsidian from near the coast, tortoise shell from the Red Sea, rhino horn, elephant tusks, frankincense, of course. Even hippopotamus hides from further inland. You can see the wealth of resources driving it all.
That rich environment, the trade networks, it all paves the way for the next big player. Right, the Aksumite Empire.
Absolutely. The sources place Aksum from the 1st to the 9th century AD, centered right there in the Eritrean highlands in northern Ethiopia.
And it got pretty big.
Oh, yeah. Its peak was maybe the 3rd and 4th centuries. Its influence stretched across the Red Sea into modern Yemen, shows you its power.
A major regional force. And the sources say Aksum was how Christianity first entered Northeast Africa, around the 4th century.
That's the key role it played, yes. Sometimes allied with the Byzantine Empire even. A huge shift for the region's identity, it really was. And the sources highlight this other really interesting early interaction with Islam.
Oh.
The Prophet Muhammad sending 15 followers to Adulis. This was back in 615 AD, before his victory at Mecca.
Why there?
The sources suggest it was partly a move against Byzantine influence, but it makes Eritrea one of the earliest places outside Arabia with documented contact with Islam.
That's a really specific, compelling detail from the sources. But Aksum didn't last forever.
No empire does. The sources document its decline, 7th and 9th centuries. Internal problems, external pressures.
And one big pressure mention was the Bejas, right, from Sudan.
Exactly. Expanding southward, conquering a lot of Aksumite land that's now in Eritrea.
While Aksum was fading, wasn't there something happening on the islands? Yes. An independent Islamic kingdom rising up in the Dahlak Islands. Right around the same time, you see these power shifts happening.
Constant change. But Aksum left a legacy, linguistically.
Definitely. The sources point out its main language, Ge'ez. Well, it evolved into Tigray and Tigrinya, 2 major languages spoken in Eritrea today, a direct link.
Okay, so after Aksum, we get into these regional kingdoms. The sources mention the 5 Beja kingdoms.
Right, 8th to 13th century. These were Cushitic people from Sudan. They'd actually been pushing into Aksumite territory for centuries already.
And their kingdoms stretch pretty far.
At their height, yeah.
Yeah.
From southern Egypt down into north-central Eritrea. The sources mention an offshoot, the Bello Kingdom.
And descendants still there today? The Heterib.
Or Tida, yes. They inhabit northern Eritrea now. Shows the endurance of these groups.
Then came the Bahre Negash, the Sea Kingdoms.
That's the next phase in the highlands, yes.
Yep.
14th to 18th century, covering that core area of modern Eritrea, Mareb River to the coast.
And how did that work? The sources mention a ruler, but also tribute. Yeah, it's interesting. The ruler, the Bahre Negash, presided over the area but paid tribute to the bigger Abyssinian king to the south. And a council of elders had to confirm things.
But that system broke down eventually.
It did. The sources say their authority really declined in the 18th century, fell into this long period of clan warfare, over 100 years.
A century of instability. Wow.
And that instability created openings. The sources note Abyssinian kings, especially from Tigray nearby, started ruling parts of the highlands in the second half of the 19th century.
Right up until
the Italians showed up in the 1880s.
But before the Italians, there were others on the coast too. The Ottomans.
Ah, yes, the Ottoman Turks. Arrived early 16th century. They controlled big chunks of the northern coast for about 300 years. Massawa became their capital for the Habesh province.
But they couldn't push inland.
No. The sources emphasize that. They held the coast, but the interior plateau. They couldn't sustain control there.
Seems like a pattern. Then Egypt?
Yep, after the Ottomans weakened. The sources detail Egyptian control from 1846 to 1885. Muhammad Ali's forces took over the Ottoman province.
And expanded it.
Right. Annexed places like Bogos and Danakil. They also pushed into western Eritrea from Sudan.
But struggled inland again.
Yes. The sources say they took major losses trying to get further into the highlands. Local resistance was strong.
And what ended Egypt's control?
The modest uprising in Sudan. That basically caused Egyptian authority in Eritrea to collapse around 1888.
Another external power receding. It's like waves washing over the coast, but the highlands remain distinct.
That's a good way to put it. All these layers, shifting kingdoms, empires, external players. It brings us right to what the sources call modern colonial rule.
Starting with Italy, 1881 to 1941.
It began subtly. The sources mention them establishing an outpost down at Assab in 1881.
A foothold.
Exactly. And they used that to move north towards Massawa as Egypt was pulling back. Then, in 1885, they just annexed the whole former Ottoman province.
Formal annexation.
And boom, January 1st, 1890, the Italian king proclaims the colony of Eritrea. Massawa's the first capital.
But they tried to expand further south, didn't they? Into Ethiopia.
They did. But King Menelik II of Shoa stopped them cold. The Battle of Adua, 1896. A major defeat for Italy.
So that defeat led to a treaty.
Yes, the Treaty of Addis Ababa later that year. It basically recognized Italy's claim up to the Mareb River, defined that southern border.
And then they moved the capital.
To Asmara, yeah. Up in the cooler highlands, 1897.
And the Italians built things. Infrastructure.
Oh, yes. The sources detail quite a bit by the early 1930s. Roads, communications, that famous narrow-gauge railway.
The one connecting Massawa, Asmara, and further west.
That's the one. Plus workshops, industries grew up around Asmara and the ports, and large farms, plantations out in the countryside.
But this development had a dark side. The sources are very clear on this.
Extremely clear. The Italians imposed this strict segregation, based purely on color.
And it limited Eritreans drastically.
Severely. Access to schools, jobs, social services, even for people with mixed Italian-Eritrean background, it was harsh.
And the sources link this directly
to growing anti-colonial feeling. Especially in the cities where people felt it most acutely, it bred deep resentment.
That Italian era ended suddenly, though, with World War II.
Very quickly, Italy's East African Empire just crumbled under British-led forces in 1941. The sources are clear on that.
So the British took over.
Yes, established a British military administration, April 1941. They put Haile Selassie back on the throne in Ethiopia and, focused Eritrea's resources on the Allied war effort first.
Did they change much initially?
The sources say not drastically, kept a lot of the Italian structure, but they did open some new clinics, schools, hired some Eritreans into the local police.
But the big shift came after the war.
That's what the sources highlight. The British allowed new organizations, trade unions, newspapers, political parties.
This was crucial.
Absolutely. It gave Eritreans a framework for political action just as the future was being decided.
Yeah.
Because Italy's colonies, their fate fell to the new United Nations.
And what happened then, politically?
A split emerged, according to the sources. You had Eritrean nationalists forming independence parties, often split along religious lines, Muslim-led, Christian-led groups. Versus some local elites and the Orthodox clergy who favored union with Ethiopia next door.
So the UN had to decide.
They sent a committee, but the sources say they couldn't agree on what to do.
Deadlock.
Yeah. And that's when the United States stepped in. The sources state the U.S. pushed hard for a federation. Eritrea linked with Ethiopia, but under the emperor.
And the UN agreed.
Voted yes. December 2nd, 1950. It officially started September 15th, 1952.
So what did this federation actually look like on paper, according to the source?
Well, the sources lay it out. Eritrea got some self-administration, police, local taxes, that sort of thing. But Ethiopia kept control of all the big stuff. Defense, foreign affairs, money, trade, communications. Everything important, really.
Eritrea got a constitution, a flag.
Yep. Constitution, parliament, flag, even two official languages, Tigrinya and Arabic. But the sources stress the key weakness. Eritrea had no real power to defend any of it.
An imbalance of power from the start.
Definitely. And the sources connect this directly to U.S. interests. Right after Federation, Washington made a deal with Addis Ababa.
For military bases.
Exactly. CAG News Station in Asmara, a huge intelligence base for the U.S. Access to naval facilities in Massawa, too.
And in return.
The U.S. equipped and trained Ethiopia's army.
Which strengthened the emperor.
Massively. And the sources are blunt. Strengthened by U.S. support, the emperor immediately started dismantling Eritrea's autonomy. Systematically.
How did he do that? What do the sources say?
It was a slow squeeze over the next decade. A preventive detention law, arresting editors, shutting down newspapers, exiling nationalist leaders, banning unions, political parties.
Taking away symbols, too.
Replacing the Eritrean flag with the Ethiopian one. Banning Tigrinya and Arabic in schools and government, seizing Eritrea's customs duties, even moving industries out of Asmara to Ethiopia.
Wow. Just piece by piece.
Until the final step, November 14th, 1962. The sources say Ethiopian troops basically forced the Eritrean parliament to dissolve itself.
And declared what?
Eritrea, Ethiopia's 14th province. Full annexation, unilateral.
And that, obviously, marks the start of the next major phase the sources cover. The liberation struggle, 1952 to 1991.
Right. But resistance started earlier, during the Federation years. The sources detail protests in the 50s against Ethiopia chipping away at the agreement.
Did anyone listen?
Internationally.
No, that's a key point in the sources. No reaction. There were mass student demos in 57, a general strike in 58.
How did Ethiopia respond?
Violently, troops fired on protesters, killed and wounded hundreds.
And the impact of that.
The sources say it convinced most Eritreans that peaceful protest was finished. It wasn't going to work. That was a critical moment. Pushed things towards armed struggle. Was there an organized movement then?
In the late 50s, yes. The Eritrean Liberation Movement, the ELM, underground, run by exiles. Popular in towns, the sources say, but
not armed.
lacked that armed strategy, yeah. That came with the next group, the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF.
Formed in Cairo, 1960.
July 1960, yes. And they explicitly declared armed struggle the only way. The first shots, September 1st, 1961, ELF guerrillas at Mount Adal.
What was their initial hope? Did they think they could win militarily right away?
According to the sources, not necessarily. They hoped maybe the fighting would get the UN's attention, force intervention, but...
But the annexation barely caused a ripple internationally.
Exactly. Very little notice.
So the ELF grew in the 60s.
It did, but the sources point out serious problems. Internal splits, ethnic and religious divisions, rivalries.
While facing Ethiopian attacks.
Brutal ones. Massacres, burning villages. Thousands fled to Sudan as refugees even then.
That sounds unsustainable.
It was. The sources described the ELF basically imploding. 1968-69, there were internal fights, attempts to reform it democratically, but they failed.
But out of that collapse, something new emerged.
Yes. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF. It formed after 3 groups split off from the ELF and talked, managed to unite.
What made the EPLF different, according to the sources?
Its program was key. A really strong emphasis on getting past those ethnic and religious divides, aiming for social equality.
So not just independence, but social change, too.
Right. Social transformation alongside national self-determination. That was the commitment. But initially they had problems.
From the old ELF?
Yeah, attacks from remaining ELF factions held back the EPLF's growth at first.
When did things change on the ground?
A big shift came after the Ethiopian emperor was overthrown, September 1974, military coup by the Derg.
And the Eritrean fronts.
The sources say the ELF and EPLF managed a truce then, focused on the common enemy. The Ethiopian army occupying Eritrea.
And they made progress.
Rapid progress. By late 1977, the sources report they controlled most of the countryside, many towns, cities. Looked like they were close to winning.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
There is. And this is where the superpowers come in, dramatically changing things according to the sources.
The Soviet Union.
Massive, large-scale Soviet intervention directly on Ethiopia's side. The sources say that's what stopped the liberation forces from winning right then.
Ethiopia's backers shifted, didn't they? Weren't they getting U.S. aid before?
They were. The sources mentioned the U.S. strategic interests, that Kagnu intelligence base in Asmara, and give the staggering figure. As late as 1976, over 2/3 of all U.S. aid to Africa went to Ethiopia, including their first jet fighters.
But then the Derg took over.
Headed by Mengistu Haile Mariam, they cut ties with the U.S., realigned with Moscow.
And the Soviets went all in.
Adopted Ethiopia as their main ally in Africa. Sent thousands of advisors, billions in arms. A total game changer.
Enabling Ethiopia to launch that huge offensive in '78.
Exactly, to try and reconquer Eritrea. The sources describe it. Over 100,000 troops, heavily armed, attacking from everywhere. Land, sea.
Soviet advisors involved.
Key roles, the sources say. Planning, executing. 4 big offensives in just 6 months.
But they were stopped.
The EPLF managed to halt them. Outside Nakfa, up in the Sahel Mountains, tough terrain.
And a 5th offensive, too.
July 1979, also beaten back at Nakfa. Heavy Ethiopian losses, according to the sources.
So stalemate again?
On the front lines, yes. But the sources note the liberation movement was still divided. Unity talks between EPLF and ELF failed again.
Leading to more internal fighting.
Tragically, yes. Renewed civil war in 1981. The sources say the EPLF pushed most ELF units out into Sudan, where they fractured.
Did any rejoin later?
Some did, yeah. Came back and fought alongside the EPLF. Others stayed refugees.
So the early 80s. What were the battles like then?
Huge. Largely unreported outside, the sources say. Hundreds of thousands of troops involved. Months long.
And Ethiopia tried again.
Yeah,
Another massive offensive.
The 6th one, codenamed Red Star, early 1982. The sources describe it as unbelievably brutal.
How so?
4 months, non-stop bombing, 120,000 troops in repeated human wave attacks, extensive use of napalm, even chemical weapons.
But it failed.
It was repulsed. Again.
How did the EPLF manage that? What were their tactics?
The sources explain they dug in. Vast networks of fortified bunkers, trenches. In that difficult mountain terrain, it let them inflict huge casualties, over 31,000 Ethiopians, while limiting their own losses.
And they captured weapons?
Large amounts. Soviet arms, equipment, big boost. Plus, they had mobile units operating behind enemy lines.
Doing what? Just attacking?
Attacking, yes. But also organizing people, providing social services where the government couldn't reach, building support.
But amidst all this fighting, there was the famine. Mid-80s.
A horrific crisis. War plus drought, the sources are clear. Devastating combination. constant risk of starvation.
And the sources highlight a political angle to the famine.
A critical one. Ethiopia deliberately blocked aid from getting to farmers in EPLF areas, weaponizing food.
And the donated food.
Much of it ended up with the Ethiopian army, while the world mostly stayed silent, according to the sources.
How many people fled, became refugees?
By 1985, the sources estimate around 360,000 had fled to Sudan, war, hunger.
And internally displaced.
Hundreds of thousands more. Many were helped by the EPLF's own relief group, the Eritrean Relief Association, ERA.
Was it effective?
Under-resourced, obviously, but the sources describe it as remarkably efficient given the circumstances.
So despite everything superpower backing the enemy, famine, internal divisions, the EPLF kept fighting.
And gained ground. The sources say they reached parity on the battlefield during the 80s.
And then came the turning point.
March 1988, near Alphabet. The sources call it decisive.
What happened?
EPLF forces smashed the Ethiopian NATO command, broke that decade-long stalemate, changed everything.
How big a battle was it?
48 hours. Wiped out 3 Ethiopian divisions, and crucially, captured their biggest supply depot. Got like a year's worth of heavy weapons equipment. Suddenly, the EPLF had serious firepower.
That must have shifted momentum.
Dramatically. The sources then detail the capture of Massawa, February 1990.
How'd they take a major port city?
Clever tactics. Small, fast motorboats attacking from the sea from the rear. Cut off the land forces. Only way Ethiopia could supply was by air.
Squeezing them out.
Exactly. And the final big battle, near Dekemhere, May 1991.
And during that battle...
Mengistu fled. Ethiopia's dictator ran off to Zimbabwe.
So the Ethiopian army in Eritrea just collapsed.
Pretty much. The EPLF marched into Asmara, started the work of building a new state.
And what happened back in Ethiopia?
Just 4 days later, the sources say the government in Addis Ababa surrendered to the EPRDF.
That's the coalition led by the Tigrayans, the TPLF.
Right. And the EPLF had actually helped them in their fight against Mengistu, too.
Wow. What an absolutely incredible, winding, often brutal journey through history we've just taken, all from this source material.
It really is staggering when you lay it out. From those deep ancient origins, empires like Aximandulus.
Through all the regional kingdoms, the colonial layers, Italian, British.
And then that incredibly long, determined liberation struggle against such overwhelming odds.
The sources just reveal so much. Resilience, strategy, but also the complexity of it all. Internal issues, external forces constantly pushing and pulling.
It really does make you reflect, doesn't it?
It does, and it leaves you with this thought, maybe. With such a long history, shifting powers, so much external interference, internal divisions too, but alongside this fierce resistance, what lasting marks might all those centuries of conflict and change leave on the nation's identity, its path forward?
That's a really deep question, something this history definitely makes you ponder.
And remember, this was only part 2 of our 7-part deep dive into Eritrea's story, based entirely on the material you provided.
That's right. Still much more to cover.
There are still 5 more episodes to come. We'll keep exploring different periods, different aspects, always drawing from these sources.
So we hope you'll join us for the next deep dive as this complex story continues to unfold.